Forget oil for a moment. Oil is the obvious story. It is the story markets understand, politicians repeat, and headlines recycle every single time the Strait of Hormuz shows up on a map. Oil is the surface layer, nothing more. Inside the Gulf, behind that narrow maritime exit, something far more important than crude is trapped. There's gas for Asian power grids, jet fuel for global aviation, naphtha for plastics, sulfur for fertilizers, urea for the next harvest, helium for MRI machines and semiconductor factories. And beneath all of it sits the chemical base of the modern food system. So when people say Hormuz carries 20% of global oil, they are not wrong. They are just thinking too small. Because the real danger is not that the world runs out of gasoline. The real danger is that the world begins running out of the molecules that make modern life possible. And once you see Hormuz this way, the picture turns terrifying. The strait is not merely an energy route. It is a pressure point under the entire industrial civilization. And today, I will show you how this, to a large extent, is exactly what underpins the strength of the dollar in the world. But here is what most analysts miss. America may not need Hormuz for its own oil. America needs Hormuz for its empire, because Japan needs it, South Korea needs it, India needs it, China needs it, Europe needs the prices it stabilizes, and the dollar needs the energy system it prices. Start with what actually moves through Hormuz, because most coverage gets this wrong. People hear oil choke point and picture gasoline. That is only a fraction of the picture. Roughly 11.4 billion cubic feet per day of liquefied natural gas passes through Hormuz. That is about 20% of global LNG trade. Not a third, as many journalists repeat. 93% of Qatar's LNG exports and 96% of the UAE's go through this strait. There is no pipeline bypass for any of it. Then there is what almost nobody discusses. Through Hormuz passes 34 to 36% of the world's seaborne urea trade, about 18.5 million tons. 23 to 29% of global ammonia exports, roughly half, 49 to 50% of the world's sulfur trade, and about a third of the planet's helium supply produced at Qatar's Ras Laffan complex, without which semiconductor fabrication plants in Taiwan and South Korea cannot cool their equipment. Add to that approximately 29% of global seaborne LPG, around 24% of naphtha supply, 13% of seaborne chemicals trade, and the container traffic moving through Jebel Ali, 15.5 million TEUs in 2024 alone. So when someone tells you Hormuz is an oil problem, understand what they are really saying. They have not looked at the data. Now, here's how the shutdown works in practice. It does not begin with an explosion. It begins with a classification. The Joint War Committee at Lloyd's of London designates the Persian Gulf as a listed area, a war risk zone. Insurers activate cancellation notices, giving ship owners 48 to 72 hours to renegotiate. Additional war risk premiums leap from 0.25% to 1%, maybe 1.5% of the whole value. For a supertanker worth $100 million, that is an extra $1 million per transit just in insurance. P&I clubs, which cover liability for oil spills and crew injuries, may refuse coverage entirely. Without P&I insurance, no port on earth will accept your vessel. Ship owners invoke force majeure clauses, conwartime, voiwar, standard language in charter contracts that allows them to refuse to enter zones their captains deem unsafe. Tankers drop anchor outside the strait. Traffic collapses. This is the blockade before the blockade. The strait stays physically open. Commercially, it is shut. And the alternatives are a comforting illusion. Saudi Arabia's Petroline, the east-west pipeline to Yanbu on the Red Sea, has a theoretical capacity of 7 million barrels per day. In the current environment, it is running at full capacity. Spare capacity is effectively zero. The UAE's Adcop pipeline to Fujairah can handle 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day, with perhaps 400,000 to 700,000 barrels of spare room. Iraq's northern route through Turkey to Ceyhan is plagued by political disputes and rarely pushes above 300,000 barrels per day. Add it all up. The EIA estimates available bypass capacity at roughly 2.6 million barrels per day. The IEA gives a broader range of 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels, against a flow of nearly 21 million barrels. That is like trying to drain a swimming pool through a garden hose. And none of these pipelines carry LNG. None carry fertilizer. None carry helium containers. None carry the food that feeds the 50 million people living inside the Gulf states who import 70 to 90% of what they eat. Strategic reserves buy time, but not much. A coordinated IEA release of 400 million barrels covers the Gulf shortfall for roughly 3 to 4 weeks. India's reserves last 10 to 18 days. Pakistan and Bangladesh have almost nothing. The timeline of escalation looks like this. In the first 48 hours, panic pricing begins. Brent crude jumps 10 to 15%. Asian spot LNG prices spike. Ships anchor outside Hormuz. After 1 week, the crisis spreads. Asian nations begin burning strategic reserves. Spot jet fuel deliveries to Europe collapse. Airlines begin canceling thousands of flights. Chemical plants in Asia start shutting down. After 1 month, the damage becomes structural. India's reserves are critically depleted. Oil may breach $130 to $150 per barrel. Farmers in South America face fertilizer shortages in the middle of planting season. Analysts at Wood Mackenzie and Macquarie project that if the closure persists for months, prices could reach the $150 to $200 range. That is the point where demand destruction kicks in, meaning the global economy simply cannot afford to consume, and a deep recession begins. Now zoom out further, because Hormuz is not just about physical supply, it is about who controls the system that pays for supply. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck one of the most consequential informal agreements in modern history. Saudi oil would be priced and sold in United States dollars. In return, the United States would guarantee the kingdom's security. Petrodollar revenues would be recycled into American Treasury bonds and assets. This arrangement did not merely support the dollar, it made the dollar indispensable. Every country that needed oil needed dollars first. For 5 decades, this system held not because it was fair, but because it worked. The United States Navy kept sea lanes open. The dollar clearing system, SWIFT, correspondent banking, and London insurance markets processed the transactions. Everyone participated because the alternative was exclusion. But a Hormuz crisis tests this bargain at its foundation. If Western naval power cannot guarantee the physical flow of energy, the financial logic behind dollar-denominated oil trade weakens. Countries do not abandon the dollar out of ideology. They abandon it when the system stops delivering. And here is what is already happening before any crisis. Saudi Arabia joined Project M-Bridge as a full participant. This is a wholesale central bank digital currency platform involving China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE. By the end of 2025, M-Bridge processed transactions worth over $55.5 billion, with more than 95% denominated in China's digital yuan. In November 2025, the UAE executed a sovereign payment to China in digital dirhams through this platform. This is not cryptocurrency speculation, this is central bank infrastructure. Wholesale clearing between sovereign institutions, running on a distributed ledger that bypasses American correspondent banks entirely. Now let me be precise, because precision matters. The dollar is not dying tomorrow. According to IMF data cited by Al Jazeera, the dollar still accounts for approximately 57% of global foreign exchange reserves. The euro holds about 20%, the yuan roughly 2%. Yuan settlement in cross-border trade sits at about 3.7%. Those are not numbers that suggest imminent collapse, but they are numbers that have been moving slowly, steadily, in one direction. What a Hormuz crisis does is not destroy the dollar. It normalizes alternatives. When SWIFT is weaponized through sanctions, when maritime insurance is controlled by London and dollar-denominated, when compliance rules are enforced through American courts, countries under pressure do not wait for a perfect replacement. They use any channel that reduces dependence, bilateral swaps in yuan and rupees, dirham-denominated energy contracts, blockchain-based trade finance pilots within the BRICS framework. Hormuz does not shatter the dollar system. It forces the world to build workarounds faster than the West can control them. And once those workarounds exist, once they carry real volume, they do not disappear when the crisis ends. This is the part of the story that even experienced analysts underestimate. Oil has detours. They're imperfect. They're insufficient. They're overloaded. But they exist. Qatari LNG has a locked door. Qatar operates one of the largest natural gas complexes on the planet at Ras Laffan. Its LNG trains liquefy gas, load it onto massive carriers, and send it through Hormuz to customers in Asia, South Asia, and Europe. There is no pipeline that takes Qatari LNG around the strait to the open ocean. The Dolphin pipeline sends gas to the UAE and Oman, but it has no spare capacity, and Oman's own export terminals are fully loaded. Social instability. Europe is exposed less through direct supply and more through price transmission and competition. When Asia begins panic buying every available LNG and crude cargo worldwide, European consumers pay the spread. That is how the shock travels. Not always through a direct pipeline, not always through a tanker that was supposed to dock in Europe. Sometimes it travels through price, through fear, through bidding wars, through every cargo suddenly becoming more valuable because one narrow passage has turned uncertain. The world, after a Hormuz crisis, whether it lasts weeks or months, will not return to the status quo. Countries will build thicker energy buffers. Strategic reserves will be expanded. Long-term contracts will replace spot market dependence. Alternative routes, however insufficient, will receive investment. And the parallel financial infrastructure now in pilot stages M-Bridge, bilateral clearing, CBDC bridges, tokenized commodity settlement will harden into permanent fixtures. This is not the death of the old system. It is the birth of a fragmented one. A world where the dollar remains dominant but no longer monopolistic. A world where American military reach remains unmatched, but its cost-benefit calculation grows less favorable. A world where Gulf states are no longer passive suppliers, but active arbiters of a new balance. They will choose between Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi based on who offers the best terms, not merely who once guaranteed their security. China accelerates overland pipelines from Russia and Central Asia. It deepens strategic reserves. It pushes the energy transition harder, not out of climate conviction, but out of strategic necessity. Every solar panel and battery factory becomes a hedge against Hormuz. Europe discovers again that its energy security was always borrowed. Not only from the Gulf directly. European crude imports from the region are only about 4%, but Europe's security was borrowed from the global pricing system that a Hormuz crisis detonates when Asian buyers panic bid for every available cargo. European consumers pay the premium. IEA estimates suggest European jet fuel reserves would last roughly 6 weeks under blockade conditions. Lufthansa canceled 20,000 flights in the 2026 disruption. That is not a statistic. That is a continent grounded. And the settlements, almost all of them historically in dollars, begin to diversify. Iran already accepts payment in cryptocurrency and yuan. Saudi Arabia experiments through M-Bridge. India negotiates rupee-denominated energy contracts. Now imagine how much dollar demand is concentrated in a corridor 3 kilometers wide. Imagine that corridor closes. Then imagine the payments finding another path. They do not all come back when it reopens. The Strait of Hormuz is usually described as an oil choke point. That description is dangerously incomplete. It is a choke point for oil, for gas, for fertilizers, for chemicals, for sulfur, for helium, for shipping insurance, for Asian industrial stability, for European aviation, for American credibility, and for the architecture of dollar-based global finance. The risk is not simply that energy becomes expensive. The risk is that the world discovers how much of globalization depends on one narrow passage staying open. And what happens when the people who control that passage, the people who insure it, and the people who patrol it can no longer agree on the terms? That is why a single strait connects underwriters in London, power plants in Karachi, farmers in Mato Grosso, chip foundries in Hsinchu, airlines in Frankfurt, gas stations in Ohio, and the future of the currency you hold in your wallet. That is why Hormuz matters so much to America. Because if so much of the world's trade, which underpins the dollar, is tied to one strait, then losing control of it means losing far more than oil. It means losing the belief that the system still works. And once that belief cracks, the world does not wait politely for Washington to repair it. It starts building another system, one workaround at a time, one contract at a time, one shipment at a time, one payment rail at a time, and that is the real danger behind Hormuz. Not just a blocked strait, not just expensive fuel, not just delayed cargo, but the moment the world realizes that the old system, the system built on American power, London insurance, dollar clearing, Gulf energy, and open sea lanes, can be interrupted by one narrow stretch of water. And after that realization, no map looks the same again. If Hormuz becomes impassable, every molecule of Qatari gas stays inside the Gulf. The consequences cascade immediately. Pakistan and Bangladesh depend on Qatari LNG for nearly 2/3 of their gas balance. For them, a Hormuz closure is not an abstract price shock. It is physical blackouts. Power plants reducing load, factories going dark, cities losing electricity. Japan and South Korea import massive volumes. Their strategic reserves are deep, 230 and 110 days respectively. But reserves are measured in oil equivalents, not LNG storage capacity, which is far more limited. And then the bidding war begins. Asia and Europe start competing for every available LNG cargo from the United States, Australia, and West Africa. Spot prices multiply. The United States could become an emergency supplier, but American LNG export terminals are already running near capacity. Increased exports put upward pressure on domestic gas prices, a political problem in an election cycle. Europe, still recovering from the loss of Russian pipeline gas, faces its energy vulnerability all over again. A gas panic can start before an oil shortage fully materializes. LNG markets are thinner, less flexible, and more contract-dependent than crude markets. You cannot simply blend substitutes or switch suppliers overnight the way you sometimes can with oil grades. An LNG carrier takes weeks to cross oceans, and regasification terminals cannot be built in a crisis. They take years. For the United States, there is a bitter irony here. America could become the world's emergency LNG supplier, but this is not purely a windfall. Increased exports would strain domestic pipeline capacity, put upward pressure on American natural gas prices, and force Washington into impossible diplomatic choices. Who gets the molecules? Tokyo, which hosts American military bases. Seoul, whose semiconductor industry feeds American tech companies. New Delhi, whose strategic alignment Washington desperately needs. Or European allies, still rebuilding energy security after cutting off Russian gas. The more Asia buys American LNG, the more Europe feels its own vulnerability, and the more American consumers pay at home. The world talks about barrels, but the first real blackout may come from missing molecules of gas. Here is where the crisis changes category entirely. It stops being an energy story. It becomes a food story. The chain is brutally simple. Natural gas is the feedstock for ammonia. Ammonia is the base for urea. Urea is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer on Earth. Sulfur, a byproduct of Gulf oil refining, is essential for producing sulfuric acid, which processes phosphate rock into fertilizer. Without these inputs, crops do not grow at modern yields. Through Hormuz Pass, approximately 18.5 million tons of urea per year, 34 to 36% of global seaborne trade. The Gulf supplies 23 to 29% of the world's ammonia exports and nearly half the planet's sulfur trade. Block this, and the impact does not hit grocery stores next week. It hits planting seasons. This is the most dangerous characteristic of the fertilizer shock. It is delayed. Oil prices rise today. Food prices rise next season. And by the time the connection becomes visible to the public, the damage is already locked in. A farmer in Brazil who cannot get urea at a manageable price reduces application rates or switches crops entirely. Brazil, the world's agricultural powerhouse, imports a massive share of its fertilizer from Gulf producers. A farmer in India, already stretched by diesel costs and dependent on Gulf ammonia for domestic fertilizer production, cuts back on nitrogen-heavy crops. Months later, yields fall. Months after that, global food prices rise. And months after that, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in countries where families spend 60 to 70% of income on food, the political consequences arrive. Not as stock market figures, but as bread riots. American farmers feel this differently, but no less sharply. Fertilizer prices rise. Diesel for tractors costs more. The economics of corn shift. Some farmers switch to less nitrogen-intensive soybeans, disrupting the feed supply for livestock. Meat prices follow. For the United States, this is not famine. It is an inflation shock that compounds existing pressures and becomes a domestic political weapon. A Hormuz crisis starts with tankers. It ends in the price of bread. I hear the counter-argument constantly. Saudi Arabia has bypass pipelines. The UAE has Fujairah. The system has redundancy. Let me address this directly with numbers. The total flow through Hormuz is approximately 20.9 million barrels per day of liquid hydrocarbons, plus 20% of global LNG, plus a third of seaborne fertilizer trade, plus helium containers and dry bulk. Total realistic bypass capacity for crude oil is perhaps 3 to 5.5 million barrels per day under the most optimistic assumptions, and much of that capacity is already being used. The Petrodollar is loaded. ADCOP has marginal spare room. The Iraqi northern route is unreliable. For LNG, zero bypass. For fertilizers, zero bypass. For helium, zero bypass. For containers feeding 50 million Gulf residents, zero bypass. Zero. And even the crude that can be rerouted faces secondary problems. Yanbu sits on the Red Sea, where Houthi attacks have already disrupted shipping. You are trading one choke point for another. Fujairah's storage terminals are within range of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles. In a regional conflict scenario, these safe alternatives become targets themselves. A bypass is only useful if the bypass itself is secure. And in a shooting war, that security is fiction. Here's the deeper problem that the pipeline narrative obscures. Insurance markets do not distinguish neatly between inside the Gulf and near the Gulf. When Lloyd's Joint War Committee expands its listed areas, as it did in the 2026 crisis, the risk zone may encompass not just the strait itself, but nearby terminals, anchorages, and coastal waters. The same financial mechanism that shuts Hormuz can make Fujairah prohibitively expensive to approach. Strategic reserves help, but they are a clock, not a solution. They buy weeks. They do not produce LNG. They do not synthesize ammonia. They do not cool semiconductor fabs. And when the clock runs out, the crisis is not over. It has merely been postponed. Pipelines can bypass a strait. They cannot bypass a system. Here is the paradox that defines America's position. The United States imports roughly 0.4 to 0.5 million barrels per day through Hormuz, about 7% of total American imports. Directly, the exposure is minimal. The United States is a net energy exporter. It has 409 to 413 million barrels in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Domestically, it can survive. But American power does not rest on American oil consumption. It rests on the global system that American military, financial, and institutional infrastructure underwrites. And that system runs through Hormuz. The hit comes on 6 fronts simultaneously. Inflation. Global oil prices affect American gasoline, diesel, and fertilizer costs regardless of where the disruption occurs. Food prices follow in an election cycle. This is politically devastating. Aviation, jet fuel supply chains are global. European and Asian route disruptions cascade into American airline operations, cargo logistics, and business travel. Military overstretch. The United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain, inside the Gulf. Escort operations, mine clearance, and deterrence consume resources. Every carrier strike group deployed to the Strait is one not available elsewhere. Allied pressure, Japan, South Korea, India, and Europe expect the United States to act. If it cannot or will not reopen the Strait quickly, the implicit security guarantee that underpins the entire alliance system and the dollar's reserve status begins to erode. Dollar credibility. If energy flows are not guaranteed, financial flows seek alternatives. Every M-Bridge transaction, every yuan-denominated oil contract, every bilateral swap is a small vote of no confidence in the system the United States built. Domestic politics. A president who cannot bring prices down or demonstrate decisive action faces a public that does not care about geopolitical complexity. It cares about the number at the gas pump. The United States does not need Hormuz the way Asia does, but American power needs the world to believe Hormuz can be kept open. So how do you calculate the risk of a total energy blackout? Not as a simple yes or no question. Not as will it happen or will it not happen. You calculate it as a measure of systemic fragility. How many critical supply chains converge on one passage? How few alternatives exist? How quickly can financial mechanisms shut down commerce before a single weapon is fired? That is the real question. The EIA estimates that in 2024, 84% of crude oil and condensate and 83% of LNG passing through Hormuz were destined for Asian markets. Asia is the front line of this vulnerability. China, with 1.4 billion barrels in total reserves and overland pipelines from Russia, has buffers. India, with reserves covering barely 2 weeks, does not. Japan and South Korea have deep reserves, but they face helium and LNG constraints that reserves cannot solve. You can store oil, you can count barrels, but you cannot magically create LNG storage, helium supply, or specialized molecules when a crisis has already begun. Pakistan and Bangladesh face the most immediate physical consequences: actual blackouts, factory shutdowns,